J.P. Morgan was also a captain of industry in the Gilded Age. He financed industries and was one of the most powerful investment bankers of the era. As an investment banker, he bought corporate stocks and bonds and sold them at a profit. With the growth of large corporations throughout the Second Industrial Revolution, investment firms like Morgan's held a very strategic position in the economy. Like Rockefeller, Morgan sought to consolidate rival firms into giant trusts. He was heavily involved in reorganizing and consolidating financially troubled railroads, and by the 1890s he controlled 1/6 of the nation's railway system. Stability in the railroad industry helped the American economy. He also envisioned an integrated steel industry that would cut costs, lower prices to consumers, produce even more steel, and raise workers' wages. With this goal in mind, he bought out Carnegie Steel and Iron Holdings, along with other major producers, and integrated them into one company. In 1901, he formed a holding company called the U.S. Steel Corporation, which became the first billion-dollar corporation. Morgan was often criticized for holding too much power that could be used to manipulate America's financial system for his own gain. But at multiple points in his lifetime, he used his influence to stabilize financial markets during several economic crises, thus helping the American economy. In this political cartoon, it shows Morgan rowing a boat. Sitting next to him is Uncle Sam, representing the American government. Morgan's enormous size reflects his stature and the importance of his banking operations to the country. As we said earlier, steel production increased greatly during the Second Industrial Revolution. This increase in production meant that rails for railroad tracks could be made from steel rather than iron at a competitive cost. Steel is durable, stronger than iron, and allowed for longer lengths of rail to be rolled. In short order, steel began to replace iron for building of railroads. To encourage the growth of business and the railroad industry, federal and state politicians provided land for the construction of railroads and cash to finance them. America was soon transformed by the completion of railway networks that connected the east and west coasts for the first time. The first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869. Two railroads, the Central Pacific starting in San Francisco, and a new railroad, the Union Pacific, starting in Omaha, Nebraska, built the almost 2,000-mile-long rail line. For years, huge forces of immigrants and Civil War veterans crossed mountains, dug tunnels, and laid track. The two railroads met at Promontory, Utah, on May 10, 1869. Railroads shrunk time and distance, and travelers could now journey from the East Coast to the West Coast in days rather than weeks by stagecoach. By the 1890s, 200,000 miles of rail had been laid. As more and more railways were laid, railroads became a huge industry. This spurred the American economy as goods and services could now be transported quickly and cheaply, and traded and sold more easily from coast to coast. Railroads transported raw materials to factories and finished goods to retailers faster than any other form of transportation. Railroads also helped the economy grow because they were large consumers of iron, steel, and lumber. Two of the most famous robber barons of the railroad industry were Cornelius Vanderbilt and Jay Gould. Vanderbilt started off as one of the country's leading steamship operators, where he earned the nickname the Commodore. In the 1860s, he changed his focus from shipping to the burgeoning railroad industry. He's been described as clever, daring, and ruthless. He's best known for building the New York Central Railroad and creating an interregional railroad system that connected Greater New York and Boston in the east with Chicago and St. Louis in the Midwest. This interregional system did away with short, fragmented routes owned by different companies and streamlined the various networks, which lowered costs and increased travel and shipment times. As part of the New York Central Railroad, he was the driving force behind the construction of the Grand Central Depot in New York City. In the early 1900s, it was torn down and replaced by the present-day Grand Central Terminal. In 1870, he also consolidated the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad into one of America's first giant corporations. Through his work in the railroad industry, he became one of the richest men in America. Before he died, he donated $1 million to build and endow Vanderbilt University. Jay Gould and Cornelius Vanderbilt were rivals in the railroad industry and also bitter enemies. Gould is often called the Prince of the Robber Barons due to the many unscrupulous things he did to get rich. One of his schemes involved purchasing run-down railroads, making only cosmetic improvements, and then selling them at a profit. In 1868, to keep Vanderbilt from taking over his Erie Railroad, Gould issued fraudulent stocks and bribed New York state legislators to legalize the stock's sale. He went on to speculate with Erie Railroad stock, tried to corner the market to increase his profits, and caused a financial panic that ruined many investors. Gould was forced to give up control of the Erie Railroad, but went on to acquire numerous railroads in the Midwest and West, including the Union Pacific, that helped complete part of the first transcontinental railroad. He then manipulated Union Pacific stock to make huge profits for himself. In 1881, his railroad empire was the largest in the nation. He owned 15% of all U.S. rail lines. During the technological revolution of this age, inventors created a host of new technological devices across a range of industries that increased efficiency and production, enhanced safety, furthered communication, and helped grow the economy. A number of inventors used their imagination and creativity towards technological advancements that helped the railroad industry. Granville T. Woods was a prolific inventor during the Second Industrial Revolution. His most significant invention that helped save lives and prevent train wrecks was the multiplex railway telegraph. Before his invention, it was extremely difficult to send telegraph messages between moving trains or between a moving train and the train station. Due to the limits of the existing technology, most messages sent or received were incomplete. Warnings of dangers on the track ahead, like washed-out bridges, rock slides, or other trains on the same track, often failed to reach trains in time. Wood's device changed rail travel and made it safer because complete messages could now be sent and received between moving trains and the station. His device allowed telegraph users between trains and the station to communicate by voice over telegraph wires. George Pullman frequently traveled on railroads in pursuit of business, but he disliked the experience. Railcars were great for transporting raw materials and finished goods, but for passenger travel it was often uncomfortable and dirty. Railroad sleeping cars for overnight travel were worse. Beds were small, and the rooms were cramped and poorly ventilated. In 1865, he manufactured the Pullman sleeping car, which was designed to be more comfortable and luxurious for overnight travel. In 1867, he established the Pullman Palace Car Company, which provided passengers with freshly prepared gourmet meals, dining cars, chandeliers, electric lighting, table lamps with silk shades, leather seating, and advanced heating and air conditioning systems. By 1900, the Pullman Company operated over 3,000 rail cars, owned 90% of the sleeping car industry, and operated the largest railroad car plant in the world. Elijah McCoy worked as a fireman and oiler for the Michigan Central Railroad, and through his work on the railroad he invented an automatic lubricator for oiling steam engines on trains. His device involved use of a lubricating cup that distributed oil evenly over the engine's moving parts. McCoy's invention allowed trains to run faster and longer with less need to stop for maintenance. Others began to copy his device, but railroad engineers wanting to make sure they were not receiving an inferior copy requested his device by name, asking for the real McCoy system. The phrase became part of his legacy. Even today, when you tell someone you want the real McCoy, you're telling them you want the real thing. As a young man, Westinghouse witnessed a train wreck where the two engineers saw one another but were unable to stop their trains in time using the existing brakes. With the technology at the time, brakemen had to run from train car to train car on catwalks atop the car, applying the brakes manually on each car. This was a labor-intensive and time-consuming process. In 1869, at age 22, Westinghouse invented a railroad braking system that used compressed air and a system of reservoirs, valves, and a single pipe that ran the length of the train, allowing the engineer to apply and release the brakes on all rail cars at once. In time, Westinghouse's air brake device was nearly universally adopted by railways, and modern trains still use brakes based on this design. Railroads also transformed America and its economy by opening up the western half of the United States to development. To encourage Western settlement, in addition to providing land for building railroads and cash to finance them, the government also distributed 160-acre homesteads to citizens, including single women, immigrants, and freed slaves, through the Homestead Act of 1862, just a few years prior to the start of the Second Industrial Revolution. Through the Homestead Act, a settler could gain title to federal land by staking out a claim and living on it for 5 years, or by buying the land at $1.25 an acre after 6 months. Through this act, in the years ahead, millions of acres were taken up by new homesteaders, ranchers, and speculators. The construction of the transcontinental railroads, the military conquest and forcible removal of Native Americans from their lands, and distribution of government-owned land lured thousands of pioneers westward. Those who moved to the Midwest typically built sod homes made of prairie grass because the plains lacked forests to build houses using lumber. But as railway networks grew, railroads were able to bring lumber from the east to enable homesteaders to build homes using wood. In addition, improvements and new inventions in threshing machines, hay mowers, planters, manure spreaders, and other devices helped farmers with their back-breaking labor. New machines helped farmers mass-produce different crops, and in 1870, American agriculture fueled the economy by providing huge volumes of wheat and corn. In the decades ahead, though, due in part to overproduction and international competition, crop prices fell and American farmers suffered. The price of land may have been cheap, but horses, livestock, wagons, lumber, seed, fertilizer, and farm machinery were not. Declining crop prices caused many farmers to struggle with high volumes of debt and even bankruptcy. In a separate tutorial titled The Populist Revolt, you'll learn more about the struggles of farmers during this era. As ranchers took up lands in the Midwest and rail lines increased, cattle and other livestock could be transported by rail car to the east and the west. However, many animals got sick or died during transport, lowering the ranchers' profits. The invention of the refrigerated rail car, which could keep meat from spoiling, allowed ranchers to slaughter the livestock before transport and ship the dressed carcasses to meatpacking plants on either coast. As a result, ranching, slaughtering, and meatpacking quickly became major new industries. During the Second Industrial Revolution, railroads not only opened up the West to expansion, but they also gave travelers new destinations to explore in the state of Florida, thanks to the work of Henry Flagler. Flagler was a businessman and one of the founding partners of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. In 1883, after traveling to St. Augustine, Florida with his wife, he decided to give up his involvement in the day-to-day operations of Standard Oil to pursue opportunities in Florida. He enjoyed his time in St. Augustine, but found it lacking in hotels and easy transportation to get there. He thought with the right accommodations and transportation systems that Florida could become a tourist destination, and he believed he was the right man to make this happen. In 1885, he began construction on the Hotel Ponce de Leon in St. Augustine and purchased the Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Halifax Railroad. The Ponce de Leon opened in 1888 to instant success. In the years that followed, Flagler opened more hotels and resorts along the east coast of Florida, built a railroad bridge across the St. Johns River to gain access to the southern half of Florida, and purchased more railroads to form the Florida East Coast Railway System. In 1905, when the U.S. took on the Panama Canal project, Flagler decided to extend his railroad and hotel system all the way to Key West. He added 156 miles of track, mostly over water, and named the extension to Key West the Oversea Railroad. Key West was one of Florida's most populated cities and would become America's closest deep-water port to the Panama Canal. Flagler also hoped his new holdings in Key West would allow for opportunities to trade with Cuba and Latin America through the Panama Canal. The Oversea Railroad to Key West was completed in 1912 and became the most ambitious engineering feat ever undertaken by a private citizen. In the decades that followed, Flagler continued to revolutionize Florida's transportation infrastructure, and the tourism and agricultural industries he established remain even today a foundation of Florida's economy.